Here's your emotional, engaging long-form story in plain paragraphs, crafted for a 15-minute YouTube narration based on the title, Widow's Daughter Heals Cowboy Not Knowing He Will Repay with Love. Let me know if you'd like chapters, dialogue, or image prompts afterward. Widow's daughter heals cowboy not knowing he will repay with love. The first time Clara saw him, he was half-conscious and bleeding in the back of an old buckboard wagon, the sunset painting the plains behind him deep red like the wound in his side. The stranger's shirt was soaked through, his breath shallow, his face ghost pale. People in their small, dust-bitten town of Willow Bend were too afraid to take in wounded cowboys. Trouble usually followed, but Clara didn't hesitate. At just 20, with her gentle eyes and stubborn heart, she jumped onto the wagon and yelled to the old farmer hauling him to stop at her mother's cabin. The widow, Mara, tried to refuse. They had little food, no money for doctors, and only Clara's limited knowledge of herbs and stitching. But one look at Clara's pleading face and the unconscious cowboy was carried into their home. Clara worked through the night, hands trembling as she cleaned and stitched the bullet wound she found just under his ribs. She didn't ask who shot him or why, she only knew that without help he wouldn't see morning. Mara paced by the window, worried someone dangerous would come looking. But as dawn broke and the cowboy's breathing steadied, Clara felt a quiet triumph, mixed with fear over what the next day would bring. When the man finally gained full consciousness days later, he introduced himself as Colt McAllister. He spoke little, voice rough from pain and dust, and his blue eyes were wary like a horse that had been pushed too hard. He tried to sit up too soon and nearly collapsed, but Clara was there to support him. He noticed right away how her hands were steady despite the struggle in her eyes, the calluses proving she worked harder than most men in town. She offered him water and broth made from the last bones they had, insisting gently that he needed strength more than they needed fear. Over the next week, Colt remained bedridden in their small cabin surrounded by cedar trees and the whispering wind. Mara kept her suspicion close, her eyes following his every movement. Clara was different. She asked nothing about his past and said nothing about their hardship. She brought him poultices, changed his bandages, and read from the old Bible her mother had nearly sold the winter before. In return, Colt observed the fraying rugs, the patched clothing, and the way Clara's portion at supper was always just a bit smaller. He listened at night while Mara and Clara whispered about unpaid debts and the threatening letters from the banker in town. He learned that Clara's father had died 3 years earlier in a storm while trying to retrieve a horse, leaving them with land that barely grew scrub and bills that wouldn't stop coming. Colt's guilt grew with every hour he occupied their space. He remembered the gunshots that night, the men who chased him for reasons tied to defending a rancher's daughter in a saloon fight. He had left the area to avoid bloodshed only to be ambushed on the road. Yet these women who owed him nothing had given everything to save his life. As he regained strength, he tried to help as best he could. One morning he put on his boots and limped outside, ignoring Clara's protests. He chopped firewood until sweat dripped from his brow and his stitches throbbed, but he gritted his teeth and finished the pile. Mara scolded him but didn't hide the relief of having heat for the next cold front. Clara watched him with a mix of irritation and admiration. No man had helped them since her father died, and certainly not without expecting something in return. Weeks passed and Colt stayed, convincing Mara it would be dangerous to travel until his wound sealed clean. In truth, he couldn't leave, not without finding a way to repay what they'd done. He mended the fence, repaired the leak in the roof, and taught Clara how to better set traps near the creek. When a group of cattle rustlers passed through town and rumors surfaced of a search for a wounded cowboy, Mara panicked. But Colt promised he'd draw danger away before bringing harm to their door. It was the first time she looked at him with something besides doubt. Clara was drawn to his quiet strength. Unlike the boys in town who boasted loud and worked little, Colt's actions spoke first. She found herself lingering when she brought him meals, asking small questions about the places he'd seen. He told her about wide rivers, canyons colored like fire, and towns where the stars looked close enough to touch. In return, she shared stories of her father singing at dusk and how she dreamed of repaying every debt so her mother could sleep without fear. One evening, Colt overheard Mara crying softly as she held a letter demanding payment or eviction. The bank intended to take their land within 2 months. Clara was already planning to sell her late father's tools and the only cow they owned. Colt felt a burning resolution settle into him like iron in a forge. He didn't tell them his plan, he only promised that things would change soon. The next week, he rode into town using a borrowed horse, his side still tender but his purpose unwavering. He located an old acquaintance who owed him a favor, an ex-rancher turned cattle broker with money and influence. Colt offered 3 months of work driving and protecting herds in exchange for enough to settle the widow's biggest debt. The man agreed, knowing Colt's reputation for loyalty and grit. Before leaving, Colt returned to the cabin and placed a small pouch of coins and a folded note on the table while Clara and Mara slept. The note simply read, "For what I owe and more. I'll come back if you'll have me." Clara found it at dawn, tears welling as reality and gratitude collided in her chest. Mara was stunned but quietly thankful, though she muttered that no man helped without wanting something. Clara refused to believe his motive was anything but honor. Months later, the cabin looked changed. The debt was partially paid, the cow remained, and Clara found small jobs sewing for neighbors. But she often stood at the window at twilight, scanning the horizon for a familiar figure. She missed the gentle weight of his gaze and the silence they shared without awkwardness. Then one spring evening, as wildflowers started blooming along the creek, the sound of hooves broke the quiet. Colt rode in, tall and strong, his face no longer haunted but hopeful. He dismounted and stood before Clara, eyes searching hers. Mara stepped to the door, arms crossed but mouth softening. Colt explained that his debt to them was far from finished. Not because of money or mended fences, but because his heart was now tied to the place and the woman who saved him without asking a single question. Clara felt tears gather again, not from sorrow but a deep, overwhelming joy she didn't know how to name. He told her he wanted to stay for good, to build a life, not out of guilt but love, the kind she had unknowingly set into motion the night she stitched his wound and whispered that he'd live. Mara looked between them and, after a long breath, nodded once before leaving them alone. Colt took Clara's hands, calloused touching calloused, and promised she would never again face hardship alone. She didn't know what the future held, but in that moment she believed in something more powerful than fear. And the cowboy who arrived as a burden repaid his life with love, not once but every day that followed.